She dreamed of freedom, but she was married off to a gardener. While her stepsister was shining at her wedding to a billionaire, she was being laughed at. But no one knew who he really was. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching from. The house at the end of Rosewood Lane stood tall and proud, with whitewashed walls, polished granite steps, and arched windows that caught the afternoon sun just right. To outsiders, it was a beacon of affluence and elegance, a home that whispered wealth with quiet confidence. But to Lillian, it was a prison cloaked in marble and silence. She'd grown up in that house, surrounded by polished silverware, expensive upholstery, and the subtle scent of imported jasmine. Yet, not once did she feel like she belonged. After her mother's sudden death when Lillian was just 9, the house began to change, not in its bricks or design, but in the temperature of its heart. Her father, a successful real estate developer, remarried a woman named Margaret within a year. Cold, calculated, and socially revered, Margaret walked into their lives like a storm in silk. With her came Savannah, her daughter from a previous marriage, tall, blonde, with eyes like glass, and a smile that could split a room in two. Savannah was everything Lillian was not: confident, extroverted, groomed for visibility. She learned piano because it impressed guests, spoke French because it was fashionable, and posed for family photos like she already belonged on magazine covers. Lillian, in contrast, was quiet, bookish, unremarkable in the eyes of the household. Her pale complexion and auburn hair were constant reminders of her late mother, which perhaps explained why Margaret never quite looked at her directly. Margaret made it clear from the start that she had no affection to spare. What Lillian received were obligations disguised as charity: a roof over her head, food on her plate, and conditional tolerance. When Lillian turned 18 and asked to apply for university, Margaret insisted they delay her education. "It's not the right time," she had said. "Besides, you don't even know what you want to do." The truth, which Lillian would only learn later, was that Margaret had already redirected those funds into Savannah's fashion school in Milan. Her father, a man weakened by guilt and always too tired from work, seldom intervened. "Let's just keep peace," he'd murmur whenever Lillian tried to bring up her grievances. By the time he died from a stroke 2 years later, she had already learned the art of swallowing anger and pretending not to exist. The will, when read, came as no surprise to Margaret. Her calm expression at the lawyer's office was that of someone who had already read the ending. Everything, properties, shares, vehicles, was left to her. Lillian received nothing but a carefully chosen phrase in the final paragraph. "To my beloved daughter Lillian, I entrust Margaret with your care, believing she will treat you as her own." It was both a blessing and a curse. What followed were months of deepening marginalization. Lillian became an invisible figure in her own home, relegated to tasks that blurred the line between family member and servant. She did the grocery shopping, cleaned guest rooms, managed the kitchen inventory, and always made sure Savannah's favorite scented candles were lit before she returned from brunches or beauty appointments. The help, the cook, the housekeeper, the driver, watched her with quiet sympathy. But they, too, had learned not to speak. No one challenged Margaret. Her control over the house was absolute, woven into every calendar, every visitor list, every dinner seating arrangement. Among the staff was a man who stood apart, not just because of his silence, but because of the space he seemed to hold around him. Daniel, the garden maintenance worker, was a tall, dark-skinned man in his late 20s with thoughtful eyes and strong, calloused hands. He arrived each morning before sunrise and left after sunset, tending to the hedges, the orchids, the vegetable beds tucked behind the guest house. He never lingered where he wasn't needed, and never spoke unless spoken to. He lived in the small service quarters at the far end of the compound, a modest single room with a tin roof and a garden view. Lillian knew very little about him. Their paths crossed only occasionally. Once she had seen him reading a book while sitting under the plum tree during his lunch break. Another time she noticed him quietly repairing a broken water pipe near the greenhouse when everyone else pretended not to see the leak. But their interactions had never gone beyond polite nods and brief exchanges like, "Good morning," or "You left your scarf." Then came the week Savannah returned from a month-long vacation in the Seychelles, escorted by a young politician with a smile too polished to be sincere. His name was Terence Adebola, and he was the son of a prominent senator, rumored to be running for office himself. Within days, the house was bustling with excitement. Margaret was ecstatic. Terence was the perfect catch. Wealthy, well-connected, and seemingly enamored with Savannah. Lillian watched it all from the margins, quietly loading dishes into the dishwasher while champagne glasses clinked in the parlor. One evening, Margaret called a family meeting, a rare event in the household. Lillian was summoned to the drawing room where Margaret, Savannah, and Terence were seated. She stood by the door, uncertain, clutching a dish rag in one hand. "We've been thinking," Margaret began, her tone oddly sweet. "It's time to talk about your future, Lillian." Lillian blinked, confused. "My future?" "Yes, dear," Margaret said, as if speaking to a small child. "It's not fair to keep you in limbo forever. You're a grown woman now." Savannah smirked, sipping her wine. "We've decided to make arrangements for you to get married," Margaret continued. "It's the proper thing to do. Every woman deserves a household of her own." Lillian's heart thumped uneasily. "Married? To whom?" Margaret smiled, and it sent a chill down Lillian's spine. "Daniel." For a moment, the room was silent. "You mean the gardener?" Lillian whispered, barely believing what she had heard. "Well, he's a man. He works hard. He needs stability. You need a place. It solves both your problems." Margaret's voice was honeyed, but her eyes were icy. Savannah burst into laughter. "It's perfect. The garden wedding, get it?" Terence chuckled awkwardly, trying to appear amused. Lillian stood frozen, the dish rag slipping from her hand. "You're joking," she said, though she already knew they were not. Margaret leaned forward. "This is not a discussion. It's settled. The papers will be ready by next week. It will be civil, quiet, nothing extravagant. We've arranged everything, and you'll be moving out of the main house, of course." Lillian wanted to speak, to shout, to cry, but the air had left her lungs. Her body moved of its own accord as she turned and walked away from the room, her heart pounding like a drum. She didn't remember how she got back to her room. She didn't remember falling asleep. But she remembered the silence that swallowed her whole, the way it always did in that house. Later that night, she sat by her window, watching the light in Daniel's quarters flicker off. Somewhere inside, something cracked, not in rage, not in defiance, but in exhausted resignation. She had fought quietly her whole life, for space, for recognition, for fairness. And now, even her future was being handed away like a chore. But one thought burned through the fog of despair. She would survive this. Somehow, she would survive. She always did. The days that followed passed in a blur of controlled chaos. No one asked Lillian how she felt about the decision. No one even mentioned it again after that evening in the drawing room, as if what had transpired was nothing more than the routine reading of household duties. But she felt the shift in the air, subtle and heavy, like a storm cloud settling quietly on her shoulders. Her room was no longer hers in spirit. It had become a holding cell, a temporary station before exile. Her every movement felt monitored, every silence interpreted as compliance. Margaret did not speak to her directly. Orders arrived through the cook or the housekeeper. "Madam says you're to visit the registry office at noon tomorrow. Madam says you'll start moving your things to the quarters behind the greenhouse." It wasn't until she saw her modest suitcase placed outside her room, neatly zipped, its handle upright like an obedient soldier, that she realized this was happening with or without her consent. She thought, foolishly, that Daniel might object, that he would refuse, laugh it off, say he wasn't interested. But if he felt anything at all, he never showed it. On the rare occasions their eyes met, his face remained unreadable. He carried on with his work as though nothing had changed, as if he hadn't just been conscripted into an arrangement more binding than any employment contract. The wedding day arrived without ceremony. There were no flowers, no gown, no distant relatives traveling to offer blessings or embarrassment. Margaret had scheduled the civil wedding for a Thursday morning, precisely because the courthouse would be empty. No one to witness. No one to ask questions. She handed Lillian a cream-colored dress that resembled something between a librarian's workwear and an outdated communion gown. It was too large, as though intentionally chosen from a generic rack. They traveled in separate cars. Daniel sat in the back seat of the gardener's van, his expression as calm as ever. Lillian sat beside the housekeeper in a borrowed sedan, staring out the window, counting the trees they passed as if each one might give her the courage to bolt. Inside the courthouse, the air was sterile. The clerk barely looked up as he confirmed their identities and passed them the forms. The magistrate recited the vows with mechanical precision. When he handed the pen to Lillian to sign, she stared at it for a long moment. The pen felt heavier than it should. She wasn't sure if it was her hands trembling or her will fighting the inevitability. But she signed, because there was no one left to stop it, no one left to care. Daniel signed next, no hesitation, no dramatic pause, just a stroke of ink on paper. With that, they were legally married. No rice, no cake, no photos. No one said congratulations. Margaret didn't even attend. Savannah was probably at the spa. The new quarters she was sent to were clean, but bare. The room had a small window overlooking a patch of red earth, a cot, neatly made, a plastic table, and a chair. The adjacent kitchenette had a single gas burner and a cracked sink. There was a tiny bathroom in the back, its faucet slow and rusty, but functional. This, she supposed, was her new palace. Daniel's side of the house was similarly modest. They shared the building, but not the space. 2 doors, 2 separate lives. He said nothing as they returned from the registry. He simply walked to his room and closed the door. She did the same. The silence between them was not awkward, but cavernous. It filled the space like invisible furniture. Lillian spent the first few days unpacking the few belongings she had been allowed to bring. A few books, her mother's old scarf, a journal she had stopped writing in years ago. She tried to make the space livable, not warm, just tolerable. They crossed paths in the mornings sometimes. Daniel, already dressed and stepping out with his work gloves, would nod politely. She would nod back. Once she made tea and left a cup outside his door. It returned empty but clean. That was the extent of their communication. Savannah's laughter still echoed from the main house during garden parties. Occasionally, guests arrived in gleaming cars. The driver would ferry them across the estate while Daniel opened the gates without complaint. Lillian often watched from her small window as he stood straight-backed and wordless, a man reduced in status but not in dignity. Then, one morning, she caught him scribbling something in a notebook near the overgrown fountain at the back of the compound. The way he stood, thoughtful, still, intrigued her more than it should have. That night, over dinner, she finally spoke. "I saw you riding earlier," she said without looking up, "near the fountain." He glanced at her. "I was. What do you write?" He hesitated, then answered, "Plans, ideas." "For what?" He folded his hands, thinking. "For the future. Business models, projects I'd like to start." She paused. "Like what?" He finally looked at her, and for the first time there was a spark behind his otherwise calm gaze. Logistics, delivery services, integrated routes for small-scale vendors, efficient dispatch systems for rural areas. She blinked. "That's specific." "It's been in my head for years," he said, "ever since I dropped out of school." "You went to school?" "University of Agriculture," he said. "I was studying agribusiness. Then my mother died. I had 2 younger brothers to feed." She sat back, absorbing the words. "And now you're here." He nodded once. "Now I'm here." They fell into silence again, but it was softer this time, less strained. That night, Lillian couldn't sleep. She sat up in bed, thinking about all the plans she once had. Studying economics, traveling, maybe working with women's empowerment programs. Dreams shelved and forgotten, like unused dishes in a locked cabinet. The days passed with a different rhythm after that. She still brought him tea. He started leaving her books, dog-eared paperbacks and agricultural journals she'd never seen before. They didn't talk often, but when they did, it was never forced. Once, she asked him why he hadn't refused the marriage. He didn't look up from his notebook when he replied, "Because I didn't have the strength to fight." And because sometimes survival is choosing the least painful cage. She understood that more than she wanted to admit. In the main house, things were louder than ever. Savannah's wedding was being planned with military precision. Guests, lists, decor samples, dress fittings. Lillian hadn't been invited to any of it. She was invisible, as always. But for the first time, she wasn't sure she cared. Margaret summoned her 3 days before Savannah's engagement party. The call came through a servant. "Madam wants to see you in the drawing room." Lillian walked in quietly, her hands still damp from rinsing vegetables. Margaret didn't bother with pleasantries. "You and Daniel will sign your court marriage certificates next week," she said crisply. Lillian frowned. "We already did." Margaret's lip curled. "That was registration. This will finalize the civil certificate. Why? Because the engagement is in 2 weeks. We can't have unfinished business lingering." "I never agreed to this," Lillian said, voice even. Margaret stood. "You don't get to agree. You live in my house. You don't have a job. You don't have a plan. This is the best offer you'll ever get." "That's not an offer. That's a sentence." Savannah sauntered in, dressed in silk and gold, and sank onto the sofa with a yawn. "Is she still complaining about marrying the gardener?" she asked. Margaret didn't answer. Lillian turned and left the room without a word. That night, she cried, not because of the marriage, but because of the finality of it all, because her dreams had been systematically dismantled. Her plans of finishing her degree, building something of her own, they were all gone. The civil signing happened just as Margaret dictated. Again, no guests. Again, no celebration. Lillian and Daniel sat across from a clerk, answered questions, signed documents. He wore a plain shirt. She wore a dress too stiff for comfort. When they left the building, they walked in silence. 2 weeks later, Savannah married in a hall decked in gold and white. Lillian was not included in the bridal train. She stood at the back, watching her half-sister dance in a dress that cost more than Lillian had ever held in her hands. The guests cheered. The band played. Margaret beamed. And in the far corner, Daniel opened the gate to let out the luxury cars, one by one. That evening, Lillian carried a small flask and a covered plate to the gate. "You haven't eaten?" she said, voice soft. He looked up, surprised. "Thanks," he replied. She placed the plate down. "Jollof rice, with fried plantain, and chicken." Their eyes met, and something shifted. Not love, not affection, just a quiet recognition of shared resilience. "I'm sorry they forced this on you," he said. She looked at him. "You've said that before. I never thought my life would turn out like this." "Same here." They sat in silence for a few moments. "I was supposed to finish my degree next year," she added. "What course?" "Economics." He smiled. "Good choice. I studied business management at university. Trouble started a year after I graduated." She turned to him, surprised. "I thought." "I know," he said. "Everyone thinks we're only what they see." She nodded, and for the first time she didn't feel like just a discarded daughter married to a gardener. She felt seen, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin something real. The days no longer blurred into one another. Something in the rhythm of life at the edge of the compound had changed, almost imperceptibly at first. Lillian no longer woke up with the same heaviness in her chest. She still didn't smile, not often, but there was a growing sense of purpose in her movements, an internal recalibration. It wasn't joy, but it was motion. It was the quiet unraveling of numbness. Daniel continued his routine with the same discipline he always had. He rose before the sun, swept the walkways even when they were already clean, checked the taps in the garden for leaks, trimmed the hibiscus, and cleaned the fountain that no one visited. Except now there was a slight difference in how he moved, like a man whose silence was no longer born from suppression, but from thought. His notebook followed him everywhere. During breaks, he could be seen sitting under the guava tree, flipping through pages filled with diagrams and scribbled bullet points. One afternoon, Lillian returned from the market and found Daniel kneeling near the neglected patch of land behind the storage shed. He was removing weeds with slow, deliberate hands, his shirt soaked with sweat, the collar darkened with dirt. She paused for a moment, watching him, and then stepped forward. "You're always here," she said. He looked up briefly. "There's work to do." She walked closer, scanning the dry, uneven terrain. The soil was compacted, with patches of stubborn grass and broken roots. A place forgotten by the main house and spared no thought by the landscapers who cared only about symmetry and aesthetics. "It's just dead ground," she said. Daniel shrugged. "It's not dead. It's ignored." He stood and dusted off his trousers, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. With the right care, it can feed a small family, maybe two. Lillian folded her arms, uncertain why she was still standing there. Why bother? No one cares what grows behind the shed. He gave her a small smile. Exactly why it matters. She didn't reply, but the conversation lingered in her mind long after she had returned to the quarters. That night, she looked out through her window and saw him digging quietly under the moonlight, placing small wooden sticks in rows, marking invisible boundaries. There was no ceremony to it, no explanation given. Just a man planting hope in silence. The next morning, she found a small paper bag on her doorstep. Inside were a pair of gloves, a folded note, and a packet of carrot seeds. The note read simply, "If you ever feel like getting your hands dirty." She stood with the bag in her hands for several minutes before walking to the plot behind the shed. Daniel didn't say anything when she joined him. He handed her a trowel, and they began working side by side, wordless and steady. By noon, her arms ached and her knees were sore, but she felt more awake than she had in months. Over the next week, they cleared the soil, added compost Daniel had been preparing in old barrels, and dug narrow furrows with a homemade rake. Lillian learned the language of gardening, not from books, but from experience. Her hands blistered, then hardened. Her clothes became stained, her nails permanently tinged with earth. But each day brought small victories. The first earthworms wriggling through the soil, the smell of fresh tilled ground, the satisfaction of sweat that meant something. During breaks, they sat on the stone steps, drinking water from shared bottles, sometimes talking, sometimes just breathing in the silence. Daniel told her about the village he grew up in, lush, green, where every home had a garden and every child was expected to help tend it. He spoke of his mother's yam fields, his first encounter with a laptop in university, his brief internship at a logistics company before life had redirected him. "I used to think education was enough," he said one evening, staring at the horizon. "That if I got my degree, I'd be fine. But the world doesn't always reward effort. Sometimes it just punishes vulnerability." Lillian nodded. "I thought the same. I thought being quiet and good would protect me. It didn't." They looked at each other for a moment, something unspoken passing between them. Not pity, not romance, but recognition. The bond of the discarded. Their garden became a secret sanctuary. No one from the main house ventured there. The workers left them alone. Even the dogs, who used to bark at every movement, grew used to their presence and began napping in the shade of the growing plants. Lillian began keeping a notebook of her own. She documented planting schedules, watering patterns, pest observations. She researched online about organic methods, compost layering, and integrated farming systems. Daniel taught her how to identify healthy roots, how to read the mood of plants by the tilt of their leaves. Together, they built a rudimentary irrigation system using plastic pipes and an old rain barrel. One afternoon, Daniel unrolled a map of the estate and pointed to a section behind the western fence. "There's an old borehole there," he said, "unused since the last renovation. If we tap into it, we can run water directly to the greenhouse." "There's a greenhouse?" she asked, surprised. "There used to be. Savannah had it converted into a photo studio last year. It's mostly abandoned now." Lillian frowned. "She doesn't even use it." Daniel nodded. "But if we ask, they'll say no. If we act, they might not notice." She hesitated, then smiled. "Then we act." It became their mission. Quiet, methodical, discreet. They repaired the borehole pump with parts Daniel salvaged from the workshop. They reconnected pipes under cover of darkness. Within 2 weeks, they had running water flowing directly to the garden. It was exhilarating. One morning, Daniel handed her a printed document. It was a copy of a grant application, one he had submitted years ago to an international agricultural foundation. Lillian read through it, impressed by its detail, clarity, and ambition. "Did you ever hear back?" she asked. He shook his head. "I never followed up. Life happened." "We should send it again," she said. "Update it. Make it stronger." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You'd help me?" "Of course," she replied. "This is more than a garden. It's a blueprint." Over the next several nights, they worked together at the kitchen table. Lillian edited the grammar, improved the formatting, added financial projections. Daniel explained logistics, sourcing, and yield models. They argued over sentence structure, debated font sizes, laughed over typos. By the time they submitted the updated application, they both felt something had shifted. Not just in the proposal, but in them. Around this time, Margaret began to notice the changes. She didn't confront them directly, but small signs of disapproval began to appear. A complaint about muddy footprints near the veranda, a sudden inspection of the service quarters, a veiled comment to the cook about people forgetting their place. Savannah, oblivious as always, continued flaunting her new life on social media. Photos of dinners with celebrities, shopping sprees, spa retreats. One image showed her posing with her husband beside a Maserati, captioned, "When you upgrade from basics." Lillian saw it by accident while passing through the kitchen. She said nothing, but Daniel, when shown the photo, chuckled. "That car has a recall on its braking system," he said. Lillian smiled for the first time in days. Their garden began yielding results. The carrots sprouted, the spinach was lush, the tomatoes ripened under the sun. They shared their produce with the cook, who in turn began slipping them extra eggs and rice. It was a small rebellion, a silent coalition of the overlooked. Then came the email. Daniel received it on Tuesday morning. He was sitting under the guava tree when he checked his phone and froze. Lillian, seeing his expression, rushed over. "What is it?" she asked. He turned the screen toward her. "Congratulations," it read. "Your proposal has been selected for the second round of review. Please prepare the following documents." Lillian clapped a hand over her mouth. "You did it!" "We did it," he said. That evening, they sat on the stone steps of the garden, watching the sun set behind the compound wall. The air smelled of basil and wet soil. Lillian leaned her head against the wooden post, exhaling deeply. "For the first time," she said, "this place doesn't feel like a cage." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's because we've started digging under the walls." And beneath the surface, their roots were already growing. The announcement changed everything. It was as if someone had gently opened a door neither of them knew existed, and the light that spilled through cast a new shape on everything. The congratulatory email from the foundation marked the beginning of a transition. From dreamers quietly surviving on the margins to contenders for something real, something recognized. Yet, even in that moment of excitement, both Lillian and Daniel knew that the road ahead would be uneven, steep, and watched by eyes that wanted them to fail. Over the following days, the air around the garden grew tense, but it wasn't between them. It came from the house. Margaret's sharp glances became more frequent, more loaded. She began asking unnecessary questions about the quarters, who had access, why the gardener had electricity on past 10, whether the hose pipe near the back fence had been used without authorization. It wasn't about the hose. It never was. It was about control, about the growing realization that what she had cast out was beginning to bloom beyond her reach. Daniel, for his part, did not flinch. He moved with a steady sense of intention, as though nothing Margaret did could unseat the foundation they were laying. Each day he reviewed the requirements listed by the foundation: legal documentation, financial statements, land ownership proof. He contacted old classmates, former professors, and anyone who might help reconstruct his academic records. Lillian helped where she could, making calls, drafting letters, scanning pages, organizing a digital file system on an old laptop Daniel had salvaged from the storage room. At night, she read grant-writing manuals and online business journals, sometimes falling asleep at the table with a pencil still in hand. Daniel would often find her like that and place a folded blanket over her shoulders before returning to his planning. They worked side by side, no longer as occupants of the same unfortunate fate, but as architects of something that could outlive their pain. The first tangible step was registering the business name. They walked together to the local registry office, dressed plainly but presentably. Daniel wore a clean white shirt and black trousers. Lillian wore a modest blouse and slacks. The clerk barely looked up as they handed over the documents, but when he glanced at the proposal attached to the application, his eyebrows rose. Organic logistics and urban farming integration, he murmured. That's ambitious. We're ambitious people, Lillian replied. The certificate was issued 3 days later. With that in hand, they began looking for land outside the compound. They couldn't use what was technically Margaret's, no matter how much of it Daniel had nurtured with his own hands. So they scoured the outskirts of the city, walking through overgrown plots and half-abandoned lots, speaking with tired landlords and skeptical agents. It was Lillian who found it, a sloped piece of land near a public school, covered in wild grass and rocks, but with good drainage and a nearby water source. It was affordable only because it had been dismissed by others. To Daniel and Lillian, it was perfect. They paid the deposit with what little savings they had, supplemented by a small loan from one of Daniel's former classmates, now a junior banker. The foundation's grant would come only after the second and final review stage. Until then, they had to work with nothing but sweat and borrowed faith. Back at the compound, Margaret's patience was wearing thin. She had hoped that marrying Lillian off to the gardener would eliminate a problem, not fertilize one. Her dinner conversations with Savannah grew increasingly bitter. "She's doing this to spite me," Margaret muttered one evening, stabbing at her food with unnecessary force. That girl always had a streak of quiet defiance. Savannah rolled her eyes. "Honestly, I think she's just bored. Let her play farmer with the help. Who cares?" "I care," Margaret snapped. "Do you realize how it looks when a nobody starts attracting attention? She's getting emails from international boards. What if people start digging into the estate records?" Savannah paused, her expression tightening. "Wait, what emails?" Margaret narrowed her eyes. "Never mind." But it was too late. Savannah began watching more closely. She started tracking Lillian's movements, noticing when she left early in the morning or returned late with soil under her nails. She saw Daniel carrying blueprints rolled under his arm and overheard conversations that were too strategic to be casual. One afternoon, Savannah confronted Lillian outside the service quarters. "So," she said, voice saccharine, "I heard you're turning into businesswoman." Lillian didn't respond. She wiped her hands on her apron and waited. "I just find it adorable," Savannah continued. "You really think you can build something serious with him?" Lillian met her eyes. "I know we can." Savannah laughed. "Well, be careful. It would be tragic to plant so much effort into something and have it all rot." Lillian said nothing. She turned and walked away. But her silence was not surrender, it was preservation. As the garden flourished, so did their plan. They converted part of the sloped land into raised beds, marked plots for different crops, and built a makeshift shed for tools and records. They hired 2 local teenagers to help with basic labor, offering them a small wage and free training. Lillian started keeping receipts, tracking every expense down to the last naira. They took photographs daily, documenting the progress. Then the email came. The foundation had approved their proposal. The grant, $200,000, would be dispersed in 2 phases, half up front, half after the first audit. They read the email together, seated on a plastic bench outside the quarters, the laptop resting between them. Neither spoke for a full minute. Then Lillian let out a laugh that quickly turned into a cry. Daniel didn't speak. He simply reached for her hand, held it gently, and let her cry. When the news broke within the compound, the impact was seismic. The cook told the housekeeper. The housekeeper told the driver. The driver whispered it to the guard at the front gate, who casually mentioned it during his shift change. Within 24 hours, Margaret knew. She summoned Lillian to the main house. It was the first time in weeks she had done so. Lillian entered the drawing room, cleaner now than she remembered it. The air conditioner hummed softly. Margaret sat stiffly in her armchair, dressed as if for a press conference. "So, it's true," she said. "You've managed to fool some foreigners into funding your little backyard circus." Lillian didn't flinch. "It's not a circus, and I didn't fool anyone." Margaret leaned forward. "You think this makes you powerful? Independent?" "It makes me free," Lillian replied. Margaret's nostrils flared. "You're still living under my roof?" "No," Lillian said calmly. "I'm building one of my own." That night, Margaret called a lawyer. The next morning, a typed notice was slid under their door, 30 days to vacate the quarters. Lillian read it slowly, folded it neatly, and handed it to Daniel. He scanned it and nodded once. "She's scared," he said. "She should be," Lillian replied. They didn't panic. Instead, they worked faster. They moved essential tools to the new site, began preparing a small room at the back of the new land as temporary shelter. Daniel's contacts came through again, donating a used generator and second-hand shelves. Lillian contacted a local church for furniture donations. Within 10 days, they were gone. No ceremony, no farewell, just a quiet departure. Margaret watched from her balcony, her eyes narrow, her mouth thin. Savannah didn't even bother to look up from her phone. The following week, the local newspaper ran a small column. Grassroots Farming Initiative receives international grant. There was a photo, not posed, just Lillian and Daniel standing in the field, hands on hips, sun behind them. Margaret ripped the paper in 2, and on the other side of the city, under the shade of a newly planted tree, Lillian unfolded a copy of the same paper, smiled, and whispered, "We're not in the dark anymore." The new land was raw and imperfect, but it breathed possibility. Its slopes and stones spoke of challenge, but neither Lillian nor Daniel recoiled. Their first nights there were spent in sleeping bags on wooden pallets, the roof above them corrugated and leaky, the air pungent with the scent of fresh soil and distant fires. Yet for all its lack of polish, the place already felt more like home than the walled estate ever had. They began with structure. A shipping container was brought in and converted into a storage unit. The shed was extended with reclaimed wood. Windows were cut and reinforced with mosquito screens. They painted the doors in deep green, not for decoration but to reflect the colors of what they were building. Life from the soil, purpose from pain. The funding had arrived promptly, half the grant transferred into a freshly opened business account. With it came the responsibility of monthly progress reports, budget tracking, and site evaluations. Lillian took this role with precision. Her past, so shaped by powerlessness, gave her a keen eye for detail and documentation. She learned to file taxes, register employees, liaise with inspectors, and respond to bureaucratic requests with language sharper than any accusation. Daniel focused on the field, planning irrigation layouts, experimenting with compost ratios, setting up trellises for climbing beans, and rotating crops with scientific discipline. He trained their 2 local teenage assistants, both of whom had never before touched a seedling, but soon began to speak of mulch and water tension as if they'd known the terms all their lives. The garden became a farm, and the farm became a statement. Meanwhile, in the estate they had left behind, the walls were beginning to crumble. Not physically, but in the way all things built on pride without foundation eventually did. Margaret's business began to falter. Several of her investors, concerned by irregular audits and poor returns, pulled out. Suppliers started demanding advance payments. The family name, once protected by alliances and marriage connections, no longer held the same sway. Even Savannah's husband, Terrence, once so eager to pose in tabloids and gala events, had grown distant. Whispers of investigations into his real estate ventures circled the capital. There were rumors of bribes, shell companies, and money laundering, all of which he denied with practiced ease. But Savannah noticed the change. The unreturned calls, the cold shoulders at social functions, the nervousness in his laughter. Back at the farm, the first major harvest came in late September. Tomatoes, peppers, spinach, cucumbers, and sweet corn filled woven baskets that lined the shaded processing area. They sold their produce at 2 local markets and delivered directly to a handful of restaurants that had agreed to trial contracts. Every kilogram was weighed and logged, every naira tracked. Lillian could hardly believe the numbers, not because they were vast yet, but because they were theirs. A journalist from a national newspaper arrived a week later, having read about their foundation's funding in a regional journal. She wore oversized sunglasses and asked direct questions. "What made you start this?" Daniel glanced at Lillian. She replied, "Necessity and dignity." "What does success mean to you?" Daniel answered, "Feeding people without poisoning the land, hiring without exploiting, building something that doesn't depend on who your parents were." The article ran under the headline, "From Servants' Quarters to Soil Innovators." There was no photo of the estate, no mention of Margaret or Savannah, but everyone who read it knew who the story referenced. Margaret did not speak of it, but the paper was found ripped and burned in the fireplace. She began making calls, not to threaten or demand, but to beg. Her first attempt was through a mutual contact in the business registry office, a suggestion that perhaps Lillian could return to help with the family affairs now that she had proven herself. The suggestion was ignored. The second attempt was more direct. She arrived at the farm unannounced, stepping out of a black car in oversized sunglasses, dressed in her usual elegance. The workers stopped. Lillian, standing near the compost bins, wiped her hands on her apron and walked to meet her. "I just want to talk," Margaret said. "I'm listening," Lillian replied. Margaret hesitated. "The house, things aren't as stable as they used to be. I know we've had our differences, but you're still family." Lillian's expression didn't change. "I was never treated as family." Margaret pressed her palms together. "That was before. People make mistakes. But surely you wouldn't want to see everything your father built fall apart." Lillian stared at her. "My father didn't build what you have. He left it to you, and you used it to diminish others, including me. I was trying to protect Savannah's future, Margaret said, her voice cracking for the first time. I didn't know. You didn't care, Lillian said. That's different. Margaret looked away. For the first time, the elegance looked strained, her skin paler, her voice thinner, her eyes unsure. Lillian didn't raise her voice. I don't hate you, but I'm not your solution. You won't help? I'm helping others, Lillian said. That's enough. Margaret left without another word. The next day, a letter arrived from a local girls' school requesting a visit to the farm. The principal wanted her students to learn about sustainable agriculture and social entrepreneurship. Daniel and Lillian agreed immediately. They set up stations, one for composting, one for irrigation, one for crop planting. Lillian spoke to the girls about ownership and choice, about making space when no one offers you one. Several of them stayed behind afterward to ask questions. One of them, about 15, whispered, My stepmother says girls like me should just marry early and not think too much. Lillian smiled gently and said, Then think louder. Word of the visit spread. Within a month, 2 more schools booked trips. Local government officials requested a meeting. A women's cooperative asked for guidance on starting a similar farm in their village. Lillian began drafting a workshop curriculum. Daniel started mentoring a group of young men interested in agricultural logistics. They were no longer building a farm. They were building a movement. The second half of the grant was released. They used it to expand the processing unit, install a solar water pump, and erect a proper fence around the property. They purchased a delivery van and branded it with their logo, green roots curling under a clenched fist. Then came the news. Terrence had been arrested. Charges were filed: fraud, bribery, illegal property deals. He was detained pending investigation. Savannah returned home, tears smeared across her eyeliner, her phone lighting up with missed calls from people who once swore loyalty. Margaret was silent for 2 days. Then she broke down. There was no money left. The house was under audit. Creditors were circling. Her driver had resigned. The housekeeper had disappeared. Even Savannah refused to eat, blaming her mother for pushing her into that marriage. In desperation, Margaret returned to the farm. This time she wasn't dressed in luxury. Her hair was unkempt, her shoes worn, her hands trembling. She was barely recognizable. Daniel opened the gate. I need to speak to Lillian, she said, her voice hoarse. He didn't say anything but led her quietly to the main structure. Lillian stood inside, sorting seeds. When she saw Margaret, she didn't startle. I know I don't deserve it, Margaret said. But please, help Savannah. She's lost everything. Lillian put the seeds down. I can't undo what's done, she said slowly. I can't fix what you built on lies, but I can offer her a place in the next training batch, if she's willing to learn. Margaret's eyes filled. Thank you. I'm not doing it for you, Lillian said. I'm doing it for who she might become. After Margaret left, Daniel walked in with 2 cups of tea. Lillian took hers and sat beside him on the bench. You didn't have to be kind, he said. I wasn't kind, she replied. I was fair. He nodded, and in the quiet that followed, they watched the farm around them stretch and settle like a living thing, content to grow at its own pace. What they had could not be bought, and what they had lost was no longer something they wanted back. The morning sun rolled over the field with the quiet patience of a world that had nothing to prove. Dew still clung to the leaves of the pepper plants, glinting like tiny silver mirrors. Lillian stood at the edge of the first row, clipboard in hand, pencil behind her ear, her eyes sweeping the field as though memorizing its contours. She no longer needed to count the rows. They were as familiar to her as the lines on her palms. But routine had become a comfort, a kind of silent ceremony to remind herself that everything in front of her existed not by luck or inheritance, but because she had refused to disappear. The past months had hardened her not into stone, but into purpose. Since Margaret's final visit to the farm, Lillian had not looked back. She had no interest in gloating. What was left of the estate and the crumbling legacy attached to it no longer held any emotional weight. Her former home was now only a place where she had once been a ghost. Out here, in the field under the sun, she was solid. She cast shadows. Daniel moved steadily along the irrigation lines, checking valves and pressure points. He paused now and then to remove a stray weed or adjust a pipe. He had always been calm, but now there was something more in his stride: ownership. He no longer moved like an employee. He moved like someone who had designed the land beneath his feet. Together, they had expanded the farm into a full-fledged cooperative. A second greenhouse had been erected with the remaining grant funds, this one dedicated to seedling research and high-yield experimentation. Lillian had initiated a data-sharing agreement with a university in the region, providing monthly growth statistics in exchange for scientific consultation. They were no longer just growing food. They were generating knowledge. The Women's Foundation Lillian had dreamed of for years had quietly come to life. It began with 3 women, referrals from a shelter in the city, who joined as trainees. One had fled an abusive marriage, another had aged out of the foster system, and the third had been trafficked and recovered. None of them had ever touched a hoe or planted a seed before, but Lillian trained them with patience, sometimes stern, always fair. Within weeks, they were planting, harvesting, sorting, and even helping new volunteers find their way around the beds. Each of the women received a stipend, training, and access to counseling services. Lillian partnered with a local NGO to provide transport and health checks. She used her business background to draft a 5-year plan, which now sat on the desk in their administrative office, a room once used for storing broken tools and now painted in soft earth tones, lined with filing cabinets, a chalkboard, and framed newspaper clippings. Daniel had quietly stepped into a new role as well. His evenings were filled with community meetings, mentoring sessions, and field visits to other cooperatives seeking guidance. He no longer introduced himself as a farmer. He was now the Director of Agricultural Systems for Green Roots Cooperative. His name appeared in farming magazines and academic journals, always accompanied by a small photo and a quiet bio that made no mention of where he had once lived or how he had been labeled. One morning, after a long round of harvest packing, Lillian received an email from her former university. The subject line was clear: "Reinstatement approved." She sat at her desk and stared at the screen. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the message. She had applied on a whim, never expecting them to welcome her back, not after the years she had been away, after she had left with no explanation, no formal withdrawal. But now, with her transcripts reconstructed and her work in the field counted as professional experience, the university had not only agreed to reinstate her, she had been offered a part-time track with a flexible schedule, allowing her to continue managing the farm. Daniel entered the office moments later, covered in soil and sweat, his sleeves rolled. Lillian turned the laptop toward him and waited. He read the email once, then again, and a slow smile spread across his face. "I always knew you'd go back," he said. Lillian looked down. "I didn't." "Well," he said, sitting across from her, "you didn't know how strong you were." The decision was made quickly. She enrolled for the upcoming term, choosing evening and weekend classes. Her area of focus would be developmental economics with a concentration in agricultural reform. The irony didn't escape her. Once, her education had been halted because it was inconvenient for someone else's ambitions. Now, it was a tool in her own hands. At night, she studied in the same space where she had once cried over the ruins of her old life. Her books now rested beside field reports and grant applications. Daniel sometimes joined her, reviewing articles or preparing his notes for a workshop he had been invited to teach. Their conversations grew richer, deeper. They debated systems of food justice, talked about distribution networks, dreamed aloud of what could come next. A second location, perhaps. A partnership with international markets. Maybe even a research institute. Despite their closeness, they had never formally redefined their relationship. There had been no declarations, no confessions, no sudden gestures. But there was something unspoken in the way they moved around each other now, a familiarity that came not from romance, but from co-survival. Their bond had been forged in fire and soil, in the hours before dawn, in the defeats and small victories, in the long silences and shared laughter. It didn't need a label. It was simply real. One afternoon, as they walked the perimeter of the property, Daniel paused near the boundary line. "I was thinking of buying the adjacent lot," he said. "It's been on the market for months. Rocky terrain, but we could build worker housing there, maybe even a learning center." Lillian stopped beside him. "You want to expand?" "I want us to own enough space that no one can ever tell us to leave again," he said. She nodded. "I'll help with the financing structure. We can approach the bank next week." He looked at her for a long moment. "You always say way now." Lillian smiled faintly. "Because it's true." The purchase went through with less resistance than expected. The bank, impressed by their fiscal record and national press, approved a modest loan. Construction began within weeks. Volunteers from nearby villages helped clear the land. The women in the cooperative painted walls, laid bricks, planted trees. It was hard, slow work, but it was theirs. They celebrated the opening of the new center with a simple ceremony. No media, no dignitaries, just staff, students, and community members. Lillian spoke briefly, standing in front of the mural one of the girls had painted. A massive tree with roots shaped like hands. "This center isn't a gift," she said. "It's a right. A place for those who've been told they don't belong. A place to plant something and watch it grow." The applause was soft but steady. Later that evening, she and Daniel sat on the porch of the administrative office sipping ginger tea. "You remember the first night in the quarters?" he asked. She nodded. "I thought I'd made the worst mistake of my life. I thought I'd never get out of that role." They sat in silence, the farm stretching before them in the dim light, the lanterns casting long shadows across the field. Daniel set his cup down. "We built this with our hands. And no one can take it from us," Lillian added. In the distance, a group of women sang softly while harvesting late vegetables. Their voices, gentle and firm, rose into the night like a lullaby for the land. And for the first time in either of their lives, there was nothing left to run from. Only the long, open path ahead. The new center stood like a quiet promise on the edge of the land, its painted walls glowing soft gold in the morning sun. It was still raw in places, unfinished windows, paths still needing gravel, a roof not yet completely sealed against heavy rains. But none of that mattered to those who gathered within it. what it represented could not be measured by the sturdiness of the beams or the gloss of the tiles. It was a threshold, a place where those once cast aside now found direction. The soil around it had already been broken for new garden beds, and inside, the first workshop was underway. On the chalkboard in the main classroom, someone had written in large letters, "Growth takes root in courage." The girls from the cooperative had painted it by hand, one letter at a time, over the course of a week. Some of them still struggled with reading, but they knew what the words meant in the marrow of their bones. Lillian stood at the back of the room, watching a former trainee teach 3 new arrivals how to germinate seeds using trays made from recycled plastic. Her own hands itched to be busy again, but today she wasn't part of the lesson. She was an observer, a guide, a founder. That word still felt too large for her mouth, too grand to sit comfortably on her shoulders. But it was the truth now. She was no longer a helper in someone else's world. She had built her own. Outside, Daniel supervised the installation of solar panels on the roof. He was explaining the circuit layout to a group of teenage boys from the village, pointing at diagrams on a wooden board, encouraging questions, listening with the patience of someone who knew the value of knowledge hard-earned. One of the boys asked why he didn't just hire electricians from the city. Daniel smiled and said, "Because if you learn how to do it here, you'll teach someone else. That's how we grow." Later that afternoon, as Lillian walked back to the farmhouse to collect the monthly reports, she paused near the main entrance where a new nameplate had been fixed the night before. It read, "Green Roots Initiative, Center for Land, Learning, and Livelihood." The words were clear, carved deeply into the wood, lacquered for permanence. She ran her fingers across the grooves, tracing each letter slowly. There was no trace of Margaret's name, no legacy of the estate, just the mark of something born without permission, but destined to stay. She entered the administrative office and found the reports neatly stacked on the table. The staff had become efficient beyond her expectations. Volunteers came and went, but the core remained solid. Women who had once arrived with only broken stories and wary eyes now managed inventory, scheduled deliveries, liaised with market vendors, and trained newcomers. One of them, Kim, had even started her own backyard plot and was now selling dried herbs to local pharmacies. Lillian had helped her draft her first invoice. The calendar on the wall showed a circle around the coming weekend. It was the anniversary of the farm's founding. A year since they had walked away from the house that had never been home. A year since Daniel's old grant application had risen from the grave like a seed sprouting in the dark. They had decided to mark the occasion quietly. No banners, no speeches, just a gathering of those who had made it possible. They would harvest, cook together, share stories under the stars. A celebration not of survival alone, but of emergence. The evening of the gathering arrived with a golden sky and a breeze that carried the smell of ripe guava and slow-burning firewood. The tables were arranged under the canopy of neem trees. Women placed pots of jollof rice, roasted yam, pepper soup, and grilled plantains. Daniel's team had built benches from reclaimed wood, and the younger trainees decorated them with cut flowers and hand-painted cloths. There were no photographers, no reporters, just hands that had dug, planted, lifted, taught, and healed. As people began to arrive, Lillian walked through the crowd, exchanging smiles and nods, checking details, offering hugs. Then she saw a familiar face at the edge of the path. Savannah. She looked different, Thinner, her makeup minimal, no designer handbag, no entourage. She wore a plain blue blouse and jeans, and in her hand a plastic container. Lillian approached her calmly. "I heard," Savannah said, her voice subdued, "about the center, about everything." Lillian didn't reply. Savannah hesitated, then extended the container. "It's Paw from my new garden. I thought maybe I could contribute something." Lillian took the container, nodded once, then gestured for her to come in. Savannah didn't say another word. She walked behind her sister, slower than before, quieter but present. That night, after the food had been served and the sun had sunk behind the hills, the singing began, first softly, then rising. It wasn't rehearsed. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of music that came from the body's memory. Old rhythms, ancestral tones, verses sung not for performance, but for release. Daniel sat beside Lillian as the fire crackled in front of them. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, quietly, he asked, "Do you ever think about that first day, when they told you to marry me?" Lillian looked at him. "Every day." He chuckled softly. "What would you have done if you could go back?" She turned toward him. "I would have said no louder, and then walked away on my own terms." Daniel nodded, his smile faint. "And now?" "Now," she said, looking around at the circle of women laughing, eating, singing. "Now I know why I stayed." He didn't press further. He reached for her hand and held it lightly. Across the field, the lights from the center glowed warm through the night, as steady as the heartbeat of a place that had found its name. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a rhythm both familiar and forward-facing. Lillian began her classes at the university. Twice a week, she left the farm early to attend evening lectures. She came back late, often with books in hand, eyes bright with debate and new ideas. Daniel adjusted his schedule to cover for her absences, and the team supported her without complaint. One morning, as she prepared to leave for campus, Daniel called her to the porch. He had something in his hand, a small box, plain and unadorned. She raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" she asked. "Something you should have been given properly a long time ago," he said. She opened the box. Inside was a simple silver ring with a carved vine pattern. Nothing flashy, just honest. "I know we were forced into something neither of us wanted," Daniel said, "but I also know we've built something neither of us expected. I'm not asking you out of obligation or history. I'm asking you as someone who's shared this land, this fight, this life with you." Lillian stared at the ring for a long moment. Then she slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "No speeches?" he teased. She smiled. "We've already said everything with our work." Their decision wasn't followed by a big ceremony. No gowns, no tuxedos, just a quiet vow exchanged one morning near the greenhouse, witnessed by the staff and the sound of early roosters. They signed the papers, then went straight back to work. In the following months, the farm continued to grow. Lillian launched a podcast interviewing women in agriculture. Daniel partnered with a tech startup to develop an app that connected small farmers to urban buyers. Together, they helped 3 other cooperatives launch in different parts of the region. Each one carried their blueprint, their seed. Back in the city, the house where Lillian had once lived was sold at auction. Margaret had moved to a smaller home in the outskirts, where she now lived quietly, away from the parties and the boardrooms. Occasionally, she called Savannah, who had begun attending training at the center once a week, learning about soil health and marketing. She never asked to be treated specially. She always brought something from her new garden. The past remained, but it no longer dictated the present. One evening, as Lillian and Daniel stood on the balcony of their new modest home built beside the center, she looked out over the fields. The moon was rising. The trees rustled softly. Lights dotted the property like stars fallen gently to earth. "You know what amazes me?" she said. "What?" "That we started in someone else's boys' quarters," she said, her voice warm. "And now, we're not just free, we're whole." Daniel wrapped his arm around her shoulder. "I didn't just gain a farm. I gained a partner. And I gained peace," she said. Below them, the laughter of women drifted through the air, mingling with the scent of the earth they had claimed. The land did not remember who had once tried to bury them. It only remembered what they had planted, and everything they had now. They had built with their own hands. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the other videos on the channel and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.